It's not like the Chinese were the first ones to do it in the world. If you go back into history, there's been many cases, many instances of Western nations, European nations also stealing
Of
technological
course,
secrets.
you're watching The Gist on Strat News Global. I'm Ramananda Sengupta. Before we start today's interview, I'd like to urge all our viewers to like, share, and subscribe. It helps you ensure that you don't miss such interviews, and it helps us spread the word. Our very, very special guest today is Aniruddh Suri, non-resident scholar with the Carnegie India, whose work focuses on the intersection of tech, AI, and geopolitics. He's also the author of The Great Tech Game, Shaping Geopolitics and Destinies of Nations. I hope I got that name correct, Aniruddh. Thank you so much for joining us, Aniruddh. I appreciate your taking time out.
No, my pleasure.
Today, we're going to be talking about not the trade war as such, but the tech war going on between the US and China and how that impacts us. How do you think that whole thing is going to play out right now, Aniruddh?
But first of all, thanks, Ramanan, for having me here. Pleasure to be back on the gist. The current war or tech and trade wars have become interlinked. Um, so today, trade, as you must have recently seen, China has also retaliated to some extent to the Trump tariffs that were imposed on it a few days ago. And a big chunk of what is being included in these trade wars are actually critical things for tech capabilities, right? Whether it's semiconductors, most advanced AI chips, or going down, very much to the bottom of that AI supply chain to rare earths and critical minerals that go into the manufacturing of some of these chips, as well as oftentimes consumer electronics equipment. And I think that how this is likely to pan out, it remains to be seen. Unfortunately, I think very few of us could say with a high degree of certainty on how exactly this US China battle will play out. But there's a few things that I think we can say with certainty. I think one, that while the Biden administration was also very clear that they wanted to retain a fair bit of distance between China as the number two tech player, as they saw it, nipping on their heels. They wanted to keep a certain amount of distance, and their whole strategy, as was made famous, was of the small yard-high fence. I think we're seeing some changes to that under the Trump administration very clearly. One is that while the broader objective remains the same, that you want to increase the distance between the number one player, as the US sees itself, and the number two player, China, I think it's no longer going to remain necessarily a small yard. Right? I think the US is now clearly willing to go beyond what anyone would have expected in terms of both the levels of tariffs and the kinds of export controls that the Biden administration, of course, started putting, but I think the Trump administration is very clearly taking forward. And at the same time, I think the other thing that is very clear is that the Chinese are not going to stand by and not retaliate. I think even earlier they've tried to use whatever pieces they had control over. It's, the Chinese dominance in critical and rare earth materials. They have started now creating a lot of export licenses and export controls around that, and that of course can hurt the US, but also other countries around the world. And so I think one thing is very clear, that how it will pan out, it might not be clear, but I think the intensification is clear. The raising of the stakes is very clear. I think the expanding of the scope is very clear. Um, do I see signs of this just being a who'll blink first type scenario? I don't think so. I think this is going to be an ongoing battle between the two. I think it's not a short-term battle. I think it'll continue. We might see, ups and downs. We might see some kind of rapprochement on certain things, as I think the US also realizes that the Chinese are not without options, as the Chinese realize that they also want to keep the world dependent on them for the critical and rare earths. They don't want the supply chains to completely move away from them over the next 2 3 years. We'll see a little bit of a song and dance, but I think we are in this for the long term.
That takes me to directly to my next question, which is that with the kind of stranglehold China has on most of the sort of supply chains for critical minerals and other technology sort of imperatives. How does one, we keep talking about safe and secure supply chains and things like that. How does one ensure that?
I think it has to be a bit of a long-term, medium-term plan. Right? I think the short-term, much like India has also relies in certain critical areas of technology, the dependence cannot be wished away like that. Right? It
Hmm.
does take time to build capabilities. It does take time to build partnerships with other countries. It takes time to invest in R&D because a lot of these critical technologies, or even the mining of certain rare earth minerals, is not something that is something that you can just pick up as a country tomorrow, right?
Right.
There's a certain amount of R&D and expertise you need to build, certain amount of resources and reserves that you need to have access to. And as you know, that these rare earth minerals are, of course, concentrated only in a few places, right?
Hmm.
During the recent Global Tech Summit that Carnegie hosted, in fact, we had some guests over from Australia as well. And I think, as some of the viewers will know, you'll know that Australia again is a big um, holder of reserves of some of the key critical and rare earth minerals, but they themselves are also dependent on the mining to be done in China, right?
Hmm.
And so this kind of dependence, unfortunately, as much as the U.S. and other countries might want to remove China from the picture, it can't be done at the drop of a hat. It will take 2 3 4 years at least, and
Hmm.
heavy investment in R&D and partnerships. I believe international partnerships, so that some countries are providing the R&D expertise, some are providing the capital, some are providing the actual mineral reserves, and some are integrating these into the core electronics supply chains or chip supply chains. So it'll have to be a concerted, collaborative effort on the part of certain countries to reduce that dependence. And I think removal of the dependence might be very hard.
You mentioned mining, but and China dominating the supply of the thing. But even processing, how important is that part of it? Can that be done by any other country?
No, even the processing, I think I was trying to say that is not so easy to just set up. It takes
Hmm.
time. And as I was saying, Australia being a holder of a lot of these reserves is still dependent on actually China for the mining or for the processing of it, right?
Okay.
So the processing capabilities are also largely in China. China also happens to be a big holder of reserves of various critical rare earth minerals, and so I think the processing piece is something that will definitely have to be set up in. I think the U.S. has already started setting up efforts to build some of its own processing facilities. I think
Hmm.
Australia, India, Japan, and the US as the Quad are also trying to set up alternative processing facilities. I think it offers India an opportunity to also hopefully host some of these processing facilities in India. For that, of course,
Hmm.
we'll need the right kind of facilities, the right kind of R&D, the right kind of partnerships, as I was indicating, with other countries,
Right.
so that the demand is clear, the investments are clear, and then the R&D is done in specific rare earth minerals. Right? There's many of them. There's at least 17 to 20 of them. There's some that categorize them as about 30. So I think India will also have to look at which specific ones India can have easy access to the actual rare earth mineral reserve, let's say from a partner country like Australia. Capital may be coming in from the US and other places. And then, of course, facilities set up here such that they can get integrated into some of the electronic supply chains that we are seeing being set up in India as part of the world's diversification strategy.
It's interesting. Before we come back to sort of India again, and what New Delhi has been up to. You said 4 or 5 years before the world gets its act together to sort of really start even contemplating alternate supply chains. What do you see the impact being in the short to medium term, with China's putting the squeeze on the export of rare minerals? How does that impact the world. I mean, and then the world generally, and us, India in particular.
Yeah, I think the impact will definitely be there at the cutting edge of technological supply chains, right? So when we talk about advanced AI chips, which is at the core of the US battle today, right? There's some places where the US and Chinese have parity in terms of, let's say, legacy chips. The Chinese have built decent capabilities. The fight is really at the cutting edge, the advanced AI chips, where the US is also trying to impose controls to slow down the development of cutting edge AI, both research and applications. And I think the reverse is also true. I think the US, the Chinese want to make sure that the cutting edge AI supply chains has at least some part where they have something to hold the world to some amount of ransom, right?
Hmm.
What that means is that for countries like India, which are not necessarily even on the semiconductor side trying to build the most advanced semiconductor fabs, right? We're not looking at those advanced 2, 3 nanometer chips. We're looking some at manufacturing some of the more legacy chips, legacy nodes. For us, it might not be as hurt hurtful, these export controls. But of course, for countries like the US, which is where these export controls are specifically targeted, I think they'll have to figure out how to expedite some of the efforts that they've already started to put in place. But I think the US will have to expedite that. Will have to, I think, increase their partnerships. Now, will there be downstream effects in terms of supply chain vulnerabilities for India? Yes. I think will prices possibly increase for certain electronics equipment? Possibly yes. Will we have a greater shortage of advanced AI chips as India tomorrow? Possibly yes, because all these supply chains get more integrated. Of course, all the top AI firms, whether it's the Nvidias of the world as the suppliers or the buyers, let's say, the Metas and the Amazons and the Microsofts and the OpenAIs and others, will start to really dominate both the supply and demand. And
Hmm.
therefore, for secondary players in the AI race, to some extent, as India is
Hmm.
today, of course, we might not have as smooth and as free a supply of the kind of chips that we might want tomorrow because the supply has gotten restricted and or expensive. So yes, there will be downstream impact on India for sure as well.
You mentioned that India is sort of designing chips, but I read somewhere that while we design them, we can't really manufacture them. Is that a correct assertion to make?
See, we have a large chunk of chip designers, of the world's chip designers today sit in India. And of course, many of them are of Indian origin sitting outside of India as well. Silicon
Correct.
Valley, of course, has gone through what is called the fabless revolution, where they've been designing the chips, but then getting them manufactured in Taiwan and other parts of East Asia. So it's not that the designing piece by itself um, is sufficient, right? Of course, as geopolitics has shown us, the vulnerabilities can be applied to different parts of the supply chain. So I think India has a lot of the chip designers, but there are 2 or 3 things that we still need to keep in mind. The chip designers are not necessarily working for Indian companies.
Hmm.
We were to talk from a purely Indian nationalistic national strategy standpoint.
Right.
Most of these chip designers are today sitting in R&D centers of multinational companies that happen to be located in India. But of course, the chip designers tend to be working for these global companies, and therefore the IP also resides with those companies,
Hmm.
right? So they happen to be sitting here doesn't necessarily mean that we have, as India, access to that IP for free, right? We don't. The IP will still reside with the employers of these Indian chip designers in India. That's one thing to keep in mind. Second, I think, as you were alluding to, the manufacturing piece is still largely in East Asia,
Hmm.
and therefore India's equally dependent on other countries for the manufacturing of these chips. Now, that said, as I think many of us know, for the last 2, 3 years, India's semiconductor mission has made strides. Tata's and others are setting up semiconductor fabs for some of the legacy chips, at least as we speak, both in Gujarat, Assam, other places. And so I think we are making progress. But of course, that does mean that there's still some way to go before we can say that we have removed some of the critical vulnerabilities in the supply chain for us and our companies.
At the just concluded Carnegie Tech Summit, Global Tech Summit, which I think you were also there, I read a very interesting paper which you had put out, which talked about the missing pieces, in India's AI puzzle. I think it was called the missing pieces in India's AI puzzle: talent, data, and R&D. Now, I'm
Absolutely.
particularly interested in R&D because why is it that such a huge country and we're not invested in R&D, despite people picking that up every now and then, saying, "What the hell are we doing?" Well, where is the main problem? Is it political will? Is it something else?
No, I think Ramanand, I think that's a question I've been also studying and grappling with for the last few years now. In fact, when my book came out, the Great Tech came about 3 years ago now almost. One of the key things that I concluded as part of the research for that book was that to win in what I've called the Great Tech game, there's a clear formula that has evolved over the last few decades. Countries that are at the cutting edge of the Great Tech game are winners, relatively speaking, compared to others, tend to have one thing common, for sure, many things. But one key thing that stood out was the R&D capabilities that they have built. Going back 50, 60 years in the case of, let's say, countries like the US, several decades in the case of a Korea and an Israel and a Taiwan, and at least 2 decades in the case of China. All these countries that today are at the cutting edge of technology in different areas, maybe different subsectors, all tend to have spent a lot of money as a percentage of their GDP on R&D, have built out vibrant industry academia linkages, and often have the private sector now outspending the government or the public sector in R&D funding. So it's not that either or. I mean, the public sector and the private sector both are spending on R&D across these countries. They're spending upwards of 2.5, 3% of their GDP collectively. These countries, some going up to 4, 5% of their GDP as well. And you're seeing some kind of mix between the public and private sector funding of R&D. Now, if you look at India, on the other hand, India's R&D spend as a percentage of its GDP has stagnated at around 0.6 to 0.7% now for decades. I have a chart, I think, in one of my other articles where I show that in 1999, both China and India are spending about 0.6 to 0.65% of their GDP on R&D, except after that, the Chinese R&D spend as a percent of their GDP leapfrogs India's, goes up to 2.5, 3%, while India's has remained at about that 0.6, 0.65%, right? And this is also largely focused in the pharmaceutical sector. Now, of course, the Indian government says the private sector has to do its bit here, which is, I think, absolutely correct. Because now, if you look at countries like the US, while in the 40s and 50s and 60s, during DARPA's time, when the internet's coming up, the nuclear bomb is being worked upon, that time, the US government is spending a lot more, 70, 80%, 90% of the R&D spend is by the government. But today that has reversed. Today, 70 to 75% of US R&D spend is by the private sector there, by some of the largest tech firms and others. And so in India also, I think we cannot today expect that the government will be doing 70, 75% of an enhanced R&D spend. The private sector has to step up, right? While government also does initiatives like the Anusandhan National Research Foundation that has been set up and been allocated about 1 lakh crores over 5 years. Well, that's a good start. That's also not enough. We've got to do more. Now, why is the private sector not doing it? Right? I think is the interesting question which you asked. I think
Exactly.
it's a mindset issue, right? I think going back, if you look at the last 2, 3, 4 decades of our economic liberalization, as the country's economy has grown, there have been lots of low-hanging fruit for our larger companies to bite off, right? So the Geos and the Airtels of the world, for example, can become very large companies by just doing the telecom services part, right? And I have not necessarily felt the need or the compulsion to do deep tech innovation or deep R&D to build out, let's say, the best cutting edge telecom equipment, right? Whether for 5G or 6G. But now you're seeing that urge that if you want to continue remaining at the cutting edge of a telecom sector or any kind of tech sector, you've got to do R&D. But partly the problem has been that we've not had the mindset or the compulsion because there has been a lot of low-hanging fruit. So I believe the private sector has not really focused on R&D spend for one, for that reason. Second, I think um, we have to believe that R&D will lead to results. I think that a lot of people in India tend to believe that R&D is either just purely wasteful expenditure, too long term for them to focus on, or not critical to their business, or that it's one of those buckets in your expenditure that get misused the most, right? And I think that mindset has got to change. I think the mindset that is clearly there in the companies in the US and China, increasingly in other technologically advanced nations like Korea and Taiwan, is that unless you're spending 5, 7, 10% of your R&D as a company, percent of
Mm-hmm.
your total turnover on R&D, you're going to get obsolete very soon. So until that mindset and that belief comes into our corporate leaders and they start going into sectors where this is actually the case and they're not just purely services players, I think that's only when we'll start to see the changes we need in order for us to, sort of transform from a purely talent and services nation to a tech and product nation.
You know, what you just said reminds me of something that, the head of a Chinese military think tank once told me almost 20 years ago. And he said that, China is moving on to, invest in AI, machine learning, and those kind of things because they believe that that was the future. But he said if India wanted to catch up, it was a big problem because just having cheap labor was never going to be good enough. And that we lacked A, the killer instinct. He said that was the primary thing. And he said, B, you guys can't even do reverse engineering well. And three, of course, you guys are all very stuck up on stuff like, intellectual property rights and things like that, which if you really want to do things, you will always get held up at that particular level. And how valid is that assessment? I mean, it's a.
Ramanan, I'm a big student of the question of why certain nations have succeeded in the past and why others have not, right? And many academics and other thinkers, economists and others have looked at this question, and there have been oftentimes cultural theories propagated to say, oh, this country doesn't have this kind of cultural mindset, or this country doesn't have the killer instinct, or this country is not scientifically oriented. I don't believe any of those cultural things to be true,
Mhm.
right? At least not in the medium to long term, not essentially, right? Of course, focus areas are different in certain countries, right? As was different in the Chinese case. It's only in the 80s and 90s that the Chinese also start looking at the US and European tech capabilities and saying, oh, listen, what is it here that they are getting right that we have maybe not been looking at? And that's when really this focus on what they call S&T at the time, science and technology, starts to come in into the Chinese mainstream. Their presidents, their leaders start visiting Silicon Valley in the 90s, late 80s to see, okay, what's working here, right? And
Mhm.
then what do we need to apply back in China for our growth? And that's when I think the Chinese also start drawing some of these conclusions that it seems that gentleman shared with you, that you cannot rely just on a game of labor arbitrage in order to become a tech advanced nation. You've got to have a scientifically focused ecosystem, a R&D ecosystem, the kinds of things I was referring to. The killer instinct point he makes, absolutely not true. I think you look at various fields where Indian companies, Indian entrepreneurs, the Indian government has shown killer instinct. So I don't believe in that cultural generalization at all. I
Mhm.
do think that what is correct is that we've got to have a much greater focus on scientific innovation, technological innovation, and true innovation, as opposed to simply taking technologies from outside and implementing. There's a big role for adoption of technology being built elsewhere and diffusing it. But at the same time, if you want to be an advanced nation, as India, I think, aspires to be, and very rightly so, given the kind of great talent we have in the field, we've got to also be a scientifically and technologically innovative nation. So I think for us, again, much like that manufacturing versus services debate that often pervades the Indian economic circles, I think on the tech and innovation side, we've got to be both an adopter and diffuser of technological
Mhm.
inventions, whether built outside or internally, but also an innovator. We've got to do both. We cannot be just doing one or the other.
he also mentioned that that we're no good at reverse engineering. How true is that?
Again, not true, right? I mean, you look at the pharmaceutical sector, for example. Um, there's a lot of reverse engineering that has been done there. I think reverse
Hmm.
engineering is again just a certain application of certain processes, right? Now, depending on the sector that you're in. Now, of course, in the case of China, one must point out that it's not like the Chinese were the first ones to do it in the world. If you go back into history, there's been many cases, many instances of Western nations, European nations also stealing
Of
technological
course.
secrets,
Yes. I'm
right?
not even
And for
going into that thing of IP and all that, because that's not the way to go. But still.
correct, correct. So there's a lot of obviously that kind of industrial espionage that has kickstarted, at least if you were to believe US claims today, in certain strategic sectors, at least the Chinese progress in certain sectors. But I think the reverse engineering piece, of course, is protected sometimes by IP laws
Hmm.
in a world which is governed by those rules, and if you want to follow those rules. But at the same time, I don't believe that reverse engineering is as hard as one might expect. And I also believe that in the world of technology, and this is my venture capitalist hat, I believe that there's space for the next disruption for you to focus on that, as opposed to only focusing on reverse engineering something that, let's say, another country or company has already innovated on. So I think the technological space is so broad that as a country, you don't have to only focus on the things that another country has done well, right?
Hmm.
There's enough other subsectors of technology that as a country you can say, okay, I'll just focus on grounds up innovation that other countries might not be focused as much on, whether it's in the
Hmm.
fields of biotech or, I can name 10 other sort of emerging fields of tech innovation that any country, once it got serious about building a vibrant and well-funded R&D ecosystem, that country and companies in that country could focus on.
Hmm. We're almost running out of time, but I thought I'd ask you a question where we sort of, I mean, let's set aside China for a while and just talk about the US. The US is, I think, we are still hoping that we'll get a lot of technology transfer from the US in many ways. And we have that US India initiative on critical and emerging technology, I think I said.
That's it.
But I've been hearing conflicting reports on that it's just there on paper, it's dead in the water, not much is happening. And with Trump now at play, I mean, do you see something moving on that part of it? And if so, where?
Yeah, so ISET is now rebranded as Trust
Hmm.
under the new Trump administration. I think that the ISET initiative itself had made a lot of progress under the Biden administration, and a lot of specific, I would say, things had gotten done, right, in terms of collaboration and to some extent tech transfer, collaborative development of certain technologies, engines. So there was, like, I would say, substantial progress made under the ISET initiative. Now, the Trust initiative, as it has been rebranded to under the Trump administration, of course, much like, whenever a new administration takes over in the US, especially if the parties have changed, there's
Right.
always, I think, a fair question to be asked about whether it'll remain as big a priority and will continue to have the same kind of momentum, or will it
Hmm.
change tack? My sense is that while you might see a little bit of delay in picking up some of the pieces that were already being put in place, I think that it will continue because the fundamental drivers of the US India tech collaboration are very, very strong and remain very strong no matter what administration comes into power in either country. And the
Hmm.
fundamentals are often now private sector driven, are geopolitically and strategically driven. And I think while the pace might vary and the focus areas might evolve, I think the fundamental drivers will remain very strong. You'll see, for example, right now also, there's a fair bit of focus on space and undersea domain awareness, technological cooperation. I think you'll continue seeing that. I think you'll see much more in terms of defense tech cooperation to continue. I think the cooperation in semiconductors, supply chains, the first half of our conversation, what we were discussing, I think the Quad building some amount of supply chain resilience together collaboratively, I think will continue. What I will say is that I think that we shouldn't, in either country, take it as a given, right? It shouldn't mean that we should get complacent. I think there's such an opportunity at this time for both countries to collaborate, given the amount of tech talent that we share, given the kind of cross-border work, whether as venture capitalists have seen it, as startups we've seen it, some of the largest US tech firms, as all of us know, have tons and tons of Indians and Indian Americans working there. We have great tech talent here and companies here. So I think the fundamentals are there. I think we just have to make sure that there's the political will to make sure that it gets more and more specific and more, um, I would say, programmatic, so that things can get done and it doesn't remain
Mhm.
just on paper.
I have a whole host of questions which just popped up from your last sort of thing, but I think we'll save that for the next time because we've run out of time. And I do hope that um, you join us again whenever we get the chance to talk again. And thank you so
Yep.
very much for taking time out. Thank you.
And thank you for having me, and I look forward to joining you again sometime.
Thank you. That was Aniruddh Suri, one of India's foremost technology experts, the cutting edge of technology, I must say, talking to us about the recent upheavals in that particular domain and where India stands. I do hope you enjoyed this particular edition of The Gist. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Till I see you again, this is Ramananda Sengupta signing out.